The ballroom at the country club had that particular kind of quiet that happens right before someone's world implodes. My grandmother held the card in both hands, reading the crayon-written message for the third time. My aunt, Patricia, had gone completely still in her chair, one hand frozen halfway to her champagne glass. Her face had drained of color in stages, first the artificial bronze from her standing tanning appointment, then the carefully applied blush, until she was just pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. She tried to push herself up from the table. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. She sat back down hard, and the chair made a sound against the marble floor that caused heads to turn from 3 tables over. My son, Oliver, stood next to my grandmother's chair, completely unaware that he'd just detonated a bomb that had been ticking for 7 years. He was wearing the little suit I'd bought him for the occasion, navy blue with a clip-on tie that had lasted approximately 40 minutes before he'd stuffed it in my purse. His hair stuck up in the back the way it always did, no matter how much I tried to smooth it down. He looked up at my grandmother with those enormous brown eyes and asked if she liked the card. If you enjoy stories about family secrets and the moments they finally surface, subscribing helps me keep sharing them. It means more than you know. Now, let me take you back to where this all started, because understanding what happened in that ballroom requires understanding what my family didn't know about the past 7 years of my life. My relationship with my father's side of the family had always been complicated by the simple fact that I was a woman who'd had the audacity to divorce their golden boy. My ex-husband, Patricia's nephew Marcus, had been the family prince, Yale-educated, junior partner at his father's firm by 28, the kind of man who looked good in family Christmas photos and knew exactly which fork to use at formal dinners. What he was less good at was staying faithful to his wife or being present for his son. But those were details my former in-laws seemed determined to overlook in favor of maintaining the narrative that I'd broken up a perfectly good marriage because I was difficult and ungrateful. The lake house had been my one refuge during the marriage. My grandfather, Edward Chin, my grandmother's second husband after my biological grandfather passed when I was young, had been the only member of Marcus's extended family who'd treated me like a person instead of an accessory. He was old school in some ways, formal and reserved, but he'd understood what it meant to marry into a family that looked at you like you'd never quite measure up. His first wife had been from the Philippines, and the stories he'd told me about her reception by Boston society in 1964 had made my own situation feel almost quaint by comparison. Edward used to take Oliver fishing off the dock at the lake house every summer. He'd bought my son a child-sized rod when Oliver was 3 and taught him to bait his own hook by 4. They'd spend hours out there, my grandfather's weathered hands guiding Oliver's smaller ones, teaching him to be patient and watch for the subtle tug on the line. Sometimes I'd watch them from the kitchen window while I made sandwiches, and I'd feel this ache in my chest because this was what a grandfather was supposed to look like. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Patricia had hated that Edward doted on Oliver. She'd made comments at every family gathering about how I was monopolizing his time, how her own children, both adults now, with their own families, never got to see him anymore because he was always babysitting my son. The implication was clear. I was taking advantage of an old man's kindness. I was manipulating him into providing free childcare because I couldn't manage my life after the divorce. What Patricia didn't know was that Edward had called me into his study one afternoon in August, 3 months before he died, and asked me a direct question. "Do you love this place?" I'd been folding towels from the linen closet, getting ready to pack up after a week-long visit. Oliver was napping upstairs, exhausted from a morning spent swimming and catching frogs at the water's edge. Edward sat in his leather armchair, the one that had molded itself to his frame over 40 years of use, and waited for my answer. "I do," I'd said, and it was the truth. The lake house was a 1920s craftsman with wide porches and windows that looked out over 2 acres of pine trees sloping down to the water. It smelled like cedar and old books and the particular kind of peace that settles over places where people have been genuinely happy. "Oliver loves it here." Edward nodded slowly. "Marcus won't keep it. He'll sell it the minute I'm gone. Put the money into some investment account and never think about it again." I'd wanted to argue with that assessment, but we both knew it was accurate. Marcus saw the lake house as a maintenance headache, septic systems and well water, and the constant battle against moisture and mice. He'd been suggesting Edward sell it for years, put the money somewhere it could actually grow instead of sitting there in timber and stone. "I want Oliver to have it." Edward's voice was firm. "I want him to bring his children here someday. I want this place to stay in the family for the right reasons, because someone loves it, not because it's an asset on a spreadsheet." I'd set down the towels. "Edward, that's incredibly generous, but nothing. I've already spoken to my attorney. The deed will transfer directly to Oliver on my death. A trust will cover property taxes and basic maintenance until he turns 25. You'll be the trustee. Patricia doesn't need to know until after I'm gone." He'd said that last part with a small smile, and I'd understood why. Patricia had been circling the lake house like a shark for years, dropping hints about how it would be the perfect vacation home for her daughter's family, how she'd always loved it, how much the grandchildren would enjoy it. Edward knew exactly what would happen if she found out he'd signed it over to Oliver. There would be lawyers and accusations, and a fight that would poison what little time he had left. So we'd kept it quiet. I'd signed the paperwork in his attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon, taking a long lunch from my job at the insurance agency where I was working at the time. The attorney, a woman named Louise Carmichael with steel gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, had walked me through every clause and contingency. The trust was ironclad. Oliver would inherit the property free and clear. Patricia couldn't contest it. Edward's mental competency had been thoroughly documented, and the deed transfer was completely legal. Edward died that November. Pneumonia, which turned into complications, which turned into multiple organ failure in a patient who was 86 and had decided he was done fighting. I'd sat with him in the hospital the night before he passed, holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Oliver had been with my mother, spared from seeing his fishing buddy reduced to tubes and monitors and the mechanical wheeze of oxygen assistance. At the funeral, Patricia had cried beautifully, the kind of controlled, dignified tears that looked good in the receiving line. She'd squeezed my hand and told me how sorry she was for my loss, and I'd thanked her, and we'd both maintained the fiction that we were family united in grief rather than opponents waiting for the will to be read. The will reading had been anticlimactic. Edward had left his children, Patricia and her older brother Richard, equal shares in his financial accounts and personal effects. The lake house hadn't been mentioned because technically it was no longer part of his estate. Louise had been present, sitting quiet and professional in her black suit, watching Patricia's face when the attorney conducting the reading stated that the real property formerly known as 447 Lakeshore Drive had already been transferred prior to Mr. Chen's death. Transferred to whom? Patricia's voice had gone sharp. "That information is not part of this proceeding," the attorney had said smoothly. "The property is no longer part of the estate, and therefore not subject to distribution under the will." Patricia had looked at Marcus, who'd shrugged. He'd assumed Edward had sold it, probably. Or donated it. Rich old people did things like that sometimes, made grand gestures in their final years to feel like they were leaving a legacy. It had clearly never occurred to him that his own son might be the recipient. I'd said nothing. I'd sat in my chair in that wood-paneled office and kept my expression neutral and thought about Oliver learning to swim off that dock next summer. The thing about secrets is that they require constant maintenance. Over the next 7 years, I became expert at deflection and misdirection. When Marcus asked where Oliver and I were spending summer vacation, I'd say up north or at a cabin and let him fill in the blanks. When Patricia made comments at Christmas about how Edward would have wanted the family to share his favorite places, I'd nod sympathetically and change the subject. I'd gone back to school during this time, using the money I'd saved from not paying rent. My mother had let Oliver and me live with her while I completed my degree. I'd finished my bachelor's in accounting, then passed my CPA exam on the second try. The insurance agency had promoted me to senior analyst. Then a small firm had recruited me. Then a larger one. By the time Oliver turned 7, I was managing a portfolio of business clients and making enough money to move us into our own place, a small 2-bedroom in a decent school district, nothing flashy, but ours. Marcus paid child support when his father's office reminded him. He took Oliver every other weekend, as mandated by the custody agreement, and spent most of that time parking my son in front of the television while he caught up on work. He'd remarried 2 years after our divorce, a woman named Stephanie who was lovely in photographs and seemed genuinely fond of Oliver in a detached, childless person kind of way. They had a large house in a suburb with good schools and a 3-car garage. They did not have a lake house because Marcus had never thought to ask what happened to Edward's property. Patricia, on the other hand, had never stopped wondering. She'd made it a hobby, the mystery of the missing lake house. She'd driven up there once, according to family gossip, and found the place maintained and obviously occupied during summer months. She'd assumed Edward had put it in some kind of trust for all the grandchildren to share. She'd started making plans for family reunions there, group vacations, timeshare-style arrangements. No one had the heart to tell her she was trespassing on my son's property when she peered through the windows. I'd had close calls. Plenty of them. The first came when Oliver was 5, and he'd mentioned the fish house to his father during a weekend visit. Marcus had asked me about it the following Tuesday, calling my cell while I was on my lunch break. Oliver keeps talking about a place with a dock and fish. Are you dating someone with a cabin? I'd been standing in the parking lot of a Panera, holding a half-eaten Mediterranean veggie sandwich. My heart had done this terrible lurch in my chest. My friend from college has a family place she lets us use sometimes. Why? Just curious. He seems attached to it. Kids love water. He's obsessed with catching frogs. Marcus had accepted that explanation because it confirmed his existing narrative about my life, that I was scraping by with help from friends, making do, still recovering from our divorce while he'd moved on to bigger and better things. He'd actually sounded a little sorry for me when he'd said, "Well, that's nice of your friend. Good for Oliver to get out of the city sometimes." I'd thrown away the rest of my sandwich after that call. My appetite had vanished, replaced by the queasy knowledge of how close I'd come to having to explain something that would lead to questions I wasn't ready to answer. The second close call had happened at Oliver's 6th birthday party. I'd made the mistake of inviting my mother-in-law, Marcus's mother Helen, who still maintained a cordial relationship with me despite the divorce. She'd always been kinder than Patricia, less invested in the family hierarchy, more interested in knowing her grandson than in maintaining appearances. Helen had brought Oliver a fishing tackle box as a gift, the kind with multiple trays and compartments for different sizes of hooks and lures. Oliver had opened it and immediately launched into a detailed explanation of which lures worked best for bass versus trout, information he'd learned from careful observation during summer mornings with me at the lake. Helen had smiled and said, "You know a lot about fishing for a city kid." "Grandpa Edward taught me," Oliver had said proudly, before he died. "And now Mom takes me to our fish house and I practice what he showed me." The room had gone quiet in that way that happens when a child says something adults find significant. Helen had looked at me with raised eyebrows. Patricia, who'd also been invited because excluding her would have been its own kind of declaration of war, had set down her cake plate. "Your fish house?" Helen had asked gently. I'd crouched down next to Oliver, put my hand on his shoulder. "Honey, remember we talked about how some things are private? How we don't need to tell everyone about all the places we go?" Oliver had nodded, suddenly uncertain, picking up on the tension he'd created without understanding its source. I'd looked up at Helen and Patricia. "I've been renting a small cabin for summer weeks when I can get time off. It's nothing fancy, but Oliver loves it. Kids need somewhere to run around, you know." "Where is it?" Patricia's voice had that edge to it, the one that meant she was cataloging information for later use. "Up in the White Mountains. Little place near Conway. The owner's an elderly woman who doesn't use it much anymore." Every word technically true, if you counted myself as the trustee owner and didn't mention that the property was actually 40 minutes past Conway on a private lake road. Patricia had smiled tightly. "How resourceful of you. I didn't realize you could afford vacation rentals on an insurance salary." "We all make our priorities," I'd said, matching her smile. "Oliver's happiness is mine." The conversation had moved on, but I'd seen Patricia pull out her phone later, her thumbs moving across the screen, probably searching rental listings in Conway. "Let her look." She'd find plenty of small cabins for rent. None of them would be 447 Lakeshore Drive. The third close call had been the most dangerous because it had involved Louise Carmichael, Edward's attorney, running into Patricia at a charity function. Louise had called me the next morning, her voice apologetic. "I may have made a small error in judgment," she'd said. "Patricia Chin approached me at the hospital gala last night. She asked if I'd been Edward's attorney. I confirmed that I had been. Then she asked if I'd handled the transfer of his real property before his death. I'd been making coffee in my kitchen, still in my bathrobe, and I'd gripped the phone harder." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I couldn't discuss client matters, past or present. But Rebecca, she's smart. She pressed me on whether the property was sold or transferred to family. I maintained confidentiality, but my refusal to answer may have told her more than a direct lie would have. So she knows it went to family. She suspects. And she's going to start asking questions. I wanted to give you advance warning." I'd thanked Louise and ended the call, then stood in my kitchen trying to think through scenarios. Patricia would start with Marcus, asking if Edward had left him anything that wasn't in the will. Marcus would say no. Then she'd work backward through family members, trying to figure out who else Edward might have favored. She'd eventually land on Oliver, but she'd assume it was some kind of college fund or trust, not an entire property. The leap from Edward was fond of his great-grandson to Edward signed over a $400,000 lake house to a child was too large for most people to make without evidence. I'd decided to do nothing. Sometimes the best defense is simply not reacting, not giving the other person anything to grab onto. Patricia had called me 2 days later, her voice sweet as antifreeze. "Rebecca, I hope you don't mind me asking, but did Edward leave anything to Oliver? A savings bond or college fund, perhaps? I'm trying to organize the family records, make sure everything is accounted for." "Not that I'm aware of," I'd said, which was true. Edward hadn't left Oliver anything in his will. The property transfer had happened months before his death. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just making sure we have everything documented properly. You know how complicated estates can be." "I do." Marcus and I went through quite a process with the divorce settlement. Lots of lawyers, lots of paperwork. I'd let that hang there, a subtle reminder that I understood legal processes and wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. Patricia had made a non-committal sound and ended the call shortly after. But I'd known she hadn't stopped digging. People like Patricia never did. They just got better at hiding what they were looking for. What I'd built during those 7 years wasn't just a secret. It was a completely separate life that existed in parallel to the one my former in-laws thought I was living. They saw a divorced single mother working an office job, living modestly, making do with help from friends and family. They didn't see the CPA with a growing client list, the woman who'd tripled her salary in 5 years, the mother who was building something stable and secure for her son. I'd started my own consulting practice the year Oliver turned 6, working from home and taking on business clients who needed someone to manage their books, prepare their taxes, advise them on financial strategy. I'd built it slowly, carefully, one referral at a time. My overhead was low: a laptop, accounting software, a dedicated phone line. My rates were competitive. My work was meticulous. By Oliver's 7th birthday, I was clearing 6 figures annually. I'd paid off my student loans. I'd built up a college fund for Oliver that would cover 4 years at a state university without him needing to take on debt. I'd started contributing to retirement accounts. I was, by any objective measure, doing well. But I drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. I lived in a modest apartment. I bought my clothes at outlet malls and considered a meal at Olive Garden a splurge. Because the thing I'd learned from my marriage to Marcus was that visible success made you a target. If Patricia knew I was financially stable, she'd find ways to use it against me, filing motions to reduce Marcus's child support, claiming I didn't need it anymore, arguing that Oliver should spend more time with his father now that I could afford better childcare. So I'd stayed quiet, stayed small, and focused on the work. My clients knew I was good. That was enough. I didn't need Patricia's approval or Marcus's acknowledgement. I just needed to keep building something that would last, something Oliver could depend on. The lake house had become our sanctuary during this time. Every summer, we'd spend 2 weeks there, sometimes 3 if I could manage it around client deadlines. I'd work from the porch in the mornings while Oliver explored the shoreline, catching salamanders and building forts from fallen pine branches. In the afternoons, we'd take the rowboat out, and I'd watch him practice the casting technique Edward had taught him, his small form silhouetted against the bright water. I'd maintain the property carefully, hiring a local handyman named Dale Morrison to check on it during winter months and handle repairs. Dale was in his 60s, semi-retired, and happy to have the work. He'd replaced the dock boards that had rotted through, patched the roof after a bad storm, updated the plumbing when the well pump failed. I paid him promptly and added a generous Christmas bonus. He never asked questions about why a 30-something woman owned a property like this, or why she wanted to keep it quiet. The trust Edward had established covered property taxes and major maintenance, but I'd supplemented it from my own income, wanting to make improvements that would preserve the place for Oliver's future. New windows that were actually energy efficient. An updated electrical panel that wouldn't trip every time we ran the window units. Small things that added up to a house that would last another 90 years if treated right. Oliver had started drawing pictures of the lake house this past year, detailed sketches that showed the stone chimney and the wraparound porch and the tire swing Dale had hung from the big oak tree. He'd labeled them carefully, our house. Not the cabin or the rental. Our house. Because in his 7-year-old understanding of the world, this was where we belonged. This was home in a way our apartment, with its thin walls and parking lot view, would never be. I'd known the secret couldn't last forever. Eventually, Oliver would mention something to the wrong person at the wrong time. Eventually, property records would surface, or Patricia would hire someone to actually search deeds instead of just making phone calls. Eventually, the parallel lives I'd been maintaining would collide. I just hadn't expected it to happen at my grandmother's 80th birthday party, with half the family watching, because my 7-year-old son decided to make his great-grandmother a thank you card. The party was scheduled for March 12th at the Waterford Country Club, which was my grandmother's preferred venue for major family occasions. She'd held her 70th birthday there, her 75th, and now her 80th. The ballroom had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the golf course, and the club had a children's menu that included chicken fingers shaped like dinosaurs, which was the only reason Oliver had agreed to come without complaining. I'd received the invitation 6 weeks prior, a cream-colored card with raised lettering that Patricia had clearly overseen. Join us in celebrating Margaret Chen's 80th birthday, it read, followed by the date, time, and dress code. Cocktail attire. RSVP by February 25th. I'd texted my RSVP to Patricia's assistant, a woman named Jennifer who handled all of Patricia's social coordination. Rebecca Thompson +1. Oliver will attend. Simple. Professional. No opening for Patricia to start a conversation about whether I could actually afford cocktail attire or whether bringing a 7-year-old to an adult party was appropriate. Oliver had asked if he could make Grandma Margaret a card. He'd been working on his cursive handwriting in school, and he was proud of how well he could write now. I'd said yes without thinking too deeply about it, imagining he'd draw her a picture of a cake or write "Happy Birthday" in his careful, looping letters. I should have paid more attention. The morning of the party, I'd found him at the kitchen table with construction paper, markers, and a piece of paper he was copying from. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated, forming each letter with deliberate precision. "What are you writing?" I'd asked, setting down his breakfast. "A thank you note. For Grandma Margaret." He looked up at me with those serious brown eyes. "You said thank you notes are important." "They are." "What are you thanking her for?" "For letting me keep the fish house. Like Grandpa Edward wanted." My stomach had dropped. "Oliver, honey, we talked about." "I know. It's private. But Grandma Margaret already knows, right? Because Grandpa Edward was married to her. So it's okay to thank her." The logic was sound from a 7-year-old's perspective. And he was right, my grandmother didn't know about the property transfer. Edward had discussed it with her before he'd finalized anything with Louise. Margaret had supported the decision, had even suggested it first according to what Edward had told me. She'd been the one to point out that Oliver had the kind of relationship with the lake house that none of her own grandchildren or great-grandchildren had ever developed. "Grandma Margaret will love your card," I'd told him, which was true. What I hadn't considered was who else might see it before it reached her hands. We'd arrived at the country club at 5:30, right on time. The party started at 6. But I'd learned from experience that arriving early meant Oliver and I could find good seats, and he could burn off some energy running around the empty ballroom before it filled with adults in formal wear who didn't appreciate children weaving between their legs. Oliver wore his navy suit, the one I'd bought him 2 months ago with room to grow. He'd wanted to wear sneakers, but I'd insisted on the dress shoes we'd found at Target, and we'd compromised by agreeing he could take them off during dinner if his feet hurt. His hair was doing its usual thing where it stuck up in the back no matter how much water or gel I applied. I'd given up and decided to call it personality. I wore a dress I'd bought 3 years ago for a client dinner, simple and black with 3/4 sleeves. Professional enough for a business meeting, formal enough for a family party. I'd done my makeup carefully, my hair in a low bun. I looked put together. I looked appropriate. I did not look like someone who owned a $400,000 property and cleared 6 figures annually. The ballroom was already decorated when we arrived, white tablecloths, centerpieces made of hydrangeas and roses, a table near the entrance displaying photographs from my grandmother's 80 years. I recognized some of them: Margaret as a young woman in the 1960s, Margaret with my grandfather on their wedding day in 1983, Margaret with all of her children and grandchildren at various holiday gatherings. Oliver went straight for the photo table, examining each picture with interest. "Is that you?" he asked, pointing at a photograph from my own childhood. "That's me at about your age." "That's my mom standing next to me." "You look funny." "Thanks, kid." He moved on to the next photograph, and I let him explore while I checked the seating chart. Patricia had arranged everything with her usual attention to status and hierarchy. Margaret would sit at the head table with Patricia and her husband Donald, Richard and his wife Susan, and my own mother, who'd been invited as a courtesy since she'd been married to Margaret's son before he'd passed away from cancer when I was in high school. I found my name at table 6, near the back of the room, next to people I didn't recognize. Probably friends of Patricia's or distant relatives who'd driven in from out of state. Oliver's name was listed next to mine with a notation, "Child meal." I'd expected as much. The seating arrangement was a message, same as it always was at these events. "You're here because excluding you would be rude, but don't mistake that for actual belonging." People started arriving around 5:45. I recognized most of them, aunts and uncles from both sides of Margaret's family tree, cousins I hadn't seen since the last major gathering, family friends who'd known my grandmother for decades. They all greeted Margaret warmly, kissed her cheek, told her she looked wonderful for 80. Patricia held court near the entrance, directing people to the bar, pointing out the photo display, making sure everyone signed the guest book. She wore a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her hair was styled in soft waves that had definitely required a professional. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd married well and had the time and money to maintain appearances. She spotted me across the room and waved, her smile tight. I waved back. We maintained the fiction of civility at these things. It was easier than the alternative. Oliver had found the appetizer table and was examining the options with skepticism. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at something on a cracker. "Salmon. Try it. It looks weird. Try it anyway. You might surprise yourself." He took one, nibbled at the corner, made a face, and set it back on his plate. "Can I have the cheese ones instead?" "Yes, you can have the cheese ones." Marcus arrived at 6:15 with Stephanie. They made an attractive couple, Marcus in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, Stephanie in a rose-colored dress that showed off her yoga instructor figure. They went straight to Margaret, hugging her and presenting her with a gift bag that probably contained something expensive and thoughtful. Marcus saw me and Oliver and came over, Stephanie trailing behind him. "Hey, buddy," he said to Oliver, ruffling his hair. "You look sharp." "Thanks, Dad." "Rebecca." Marcus nodded at me. "Marcus." "Stephanie, you look lovely." "Thank you." Stephanie's smile was genuine. She was always kind to me, which made it harder to dislike her. How have you been? Good. Busy with work. You? Same. We just got back from Aruba last week. That sounds nice. The conversation limped along for another minute before Marcus and Stephanie excused themselves to get drinks. Oliver watched them go, then looked up at me. Do I have to sit with Dad during dinner? No, honey. You're sitting with me. Good. Helen arrived next, Marcus's mother, carrying a wrapped present and wearing a dress I recognized from Richard's retirement party 2 years ago. She was a practical woman, not given to Patricia's kind of social performance. She hugged me warmly when she reached our table. Rebecca, you look well. Thank you, Helen. So do you. She crouched down to Oliver's level. And how's my favorite fisherman? Good. I caught 3 bass this summer. One was this big. He spread his hands apart in the universal gesture of exaggerated fish size. I bet it was. Did you use the tackle box I gave you? All the time. The green lure works really well. Helen glanced at me, and I could see the question forming. Where had Oliver been catching these fish? What cabin was I renting? How was I affording summer vacations? Before she could ask, Patricia's voice cut through the ambient conversation. If everyone could please find their seats, we'll be starting dinner shortly. The crowd began migrating toward their assigned tables. Helen squeezed my arm and headed toward the front where she'd been seated with the rest of the immediate family. Oliver and I made our way to table 6, where we were joined by a couple in their 60s who introduced themselves as Margaret's former neighbors, a woman who'd worked with my grandmother at the library before she retired, and a man who turned out to be someone's husband and seemed unclear on why he was there. The conversation at our table was pleasant and impersonal. The neighbors asked Oliver about school. The library colleague told stories about my grandmother's dedication to the literacy program. The confused husband ate his salad and checked his phone under the table. Dinner was served, chicken or fish, the eternal country club dichotomy. Oliver got his dinosaur-shaped chicken fingers and was happy. I had the salmon and made small talk and kept one eye on the head table, where Patricia was laughing at something Donald had said and Margaret was smiling serenely at the room full of people who'd come to celebrate her. The cake came out after dinner, a massive 3-tiered construction with Happy 80th Birthday Margaret written in elegant script across the top. Everyone sang. Margaret blew out the candles with help from Oliver and 2 other great-grandchildren who'd been summoned to the front for photo purposes. Patricia took approximately 600 pictures from various angles. Then came the gifts. There was a system to these things, an unspoken hierarchy. Close family went first, starting with Patricia, who presented a framed collage of family photos she'd clearly spent weeks assembling. Margaret cried. Everyone applauded. Richard went next with a donation made in Margaret's name to the Literacy Foundation she'd supported for years. More tears, more applause. Helen gave Margaret a beautiful shawl she'd knitted herself. Margaret wrapped it around her shoulders immediately and declared she'd never take it off. The other guests presented their offerings, gift certificates to Margaret's favorite restaurant, books, a spa package, tickets to the symphony. Oliver had been holding his card the entire time, clutched in both hands. I'd told him he could give it to Grandma Margaret after the party, when things were quieter, but he'd insisted he wanted to do it with everyone else. Can I go now? He whispered to me. I looked at the line of people still waiting to present gifts. Let's wait until after the crowd thins out a bit. But I want her to open it now. Oliver, it's a card. It's not the same as the other gifts. We can give it to her later. His lower lip jutted out. You said thank you notes are important. They are, but... He was already sliding out of his chair. Before I could stop him, he was walking toward the head table, his card held out in front of him like an offering. I stood up, intending to intercept him, but he was small and fast, and he slipped through the crowd easily. By the time I reached the front of the room, he was already standing next to Margaret's chair. Grandma Margaret, I made you something, he was saying. Margaret's face lit up. Did you, sweetheart? Let me see. Patricia materialized next to them. She looked at the construction paper card in Oliver's hands, at the crayon drawing on the front, a house with a dock and water and trees that looked like green lollipops. Grandma doesn't need kid crafts, Patricia's voice carried across the room. People at nearby tables stopped talking. Throw it away. The room did that thing where it doesn't go completely silent, but the quality of the noise changes. Conversations continued, but people were listening now. Watching. Margaret's hand came out, gentle but firm. Let me see it first. Oliver handed her the card, shooting Patricia a look that was pure 7-year-old defiance. I reached the head table just as Margaret was opening it. Inside was the note Oliver had been working on that morning, written in his careful cursive. Dear Grandma Margaret, thank you for letting me keep our special place. Grandpa Edward wanted me to have it, and I promised to take good care of it forever. I will bring my kids there someday just like he wanted. Love, your grandson Oliver. And underneath the note, folded carefully, was a document I'd given Oliver that morning when he'd asked if he could include it in his card. A document I'd been carrying in my purse for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to present it. The property deed to 447 Lakeshore Drive, showing Oliver Thompson-Chin as the legal owner, with Rebecca Thompson listed as trustee. Signed by Edward Chin on August 15th, 3 months before his death. Notarized by Louise Carmichael. Margaret read the note first, her eyes moving slowly over Oliver's handwriting. Then she unfolded the document. Her expression didn't change much, a slight widening of the eyes, a small smile. Well, she said quietly. Edward kept his word. Patricia grabbed for the card. What is that? Let me see. Margaret held it away from her. It's a private matter between Edward and his great-grandson. If it involves family property, it's not private. Patricia's voice had gone sharp. She reached for the card again. I moved forward. Patricia, don't. She turned to face me, and I saw the exact moment she understood. Her eyes went from the card to my face to Oliver, who was standing there in his little suit looking confused about why the adults were acting strange. You knew about this. Not a question. An accusation. I've been the trustee since Edward signed the deed over. Yes, I knew. The lake house. Her voice came out different. Higher. Edward gave the lake house to a child. To his great-grandson. Yes. The conversations around us had stopped completely now. People were watching openly. Helen had stood up from her seat. Marcus was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Patricia's face was doing something complicated. The color was draining from it in stages, leaving her foundation standing out in patches against her skin. That's impossible. We would have known. It would have been in the will. It wasn't in the will because the transfer happened before Edward died. He signed the deed over in August. The property was no longer part of his estate when he passed. You're lying. But her voice had no conviction behind it. Margaret spoke up, her voice calm. She's not lying, Patricia. Edward discussed it with me before he went to the attorney. We both agreed Oliver should have it. Patricia turned on her stepmother. You knew? You knew and you didn't tell me. Edward asked me not to. It was his property to dispose of as he wished. That house has been in our family for 40 years. And now it will stay in the family for 40 more. Margaret's tone was final. Through Oliver. Patricia's hand was shaking. She'd set her champagne glass down at some point, and now she gripped the back of Margaret's chair for support. You can't do this. There are laws about property transfers. I'll contest it. I'll take this to court. You can try. I kept my voice level. But Edward's attorney made sure everything was legal. His mental competency was documented. The deed transfer was witnessed and notarized. Oliver is the legal owner. I'm the trustee until he turns 25, at which point full control transfers to him. There's a trust that covers property taxes and maintenance. It's all been handled. By who? You. Patricia's laugh came out shrill. You don't have the money to maintain a property like that. You can barely afford that apartment you're renting. I own the apartment building. The words came out before I'd fully decided to say them. But there they were, hanging in the air between us. I bought it 2 years ago. I live in one unit and rent out the other 3. The rental income covers the mortgage and property taxes, with enough left over to contribute to Oliver's college fund. Patricia blinked. You what? I also own my consulting practice, which did $730,000 in revenue last year. I have 12 business clients who pay me between $3,000 and $8,000 monthly for accounting and financial advisory services. I have a retirement account, an emergency fund, and Oliver's college education is fully funded through a 529 plan. So yes, Patricia, I can afford to maintain the lake house. I've been doing it for 7 years. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. This wasn't people pretending not to listen while they eavesdropped. This was genuine shock. Marcus found his voice first. 700,000? Rebecca, that can't. It is. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Patricia, watching her try to process information that didn't fit with the narrative she'd constructed about my life. Helen spoke up, her voice quiet. You own an apartment building? A 4-unit brownstone in Dorchester. I got it for $420,000 before prices went completely insane. Put down 20% from savings. It's worth about $750 now. The consulting practice. Patricia was still shaking her head. You work for an insurance company. I quit the insurance company 5 years ago. I've been running my own practice since then. You'd know that if you'd ever asked what I actually do for work instead of assuming. Someone at a nearby table coughed. A chair scraped against the floor. The waitstaff had frozen near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to continue clearing plates or wait for the family drama to resolve itself. Patricia's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. She looked at Donald, her husband, who'd been silent through the entire exchange. He shrugged helplessly. You've been lying to us. Patricia finally managed. For years. Pretending to struggle while you were. I never pretended anything. I never said I was struggling. You assumed I was because that's what fit your story about how I ruined Marcus's life by divorcing him. You wanted me to fail, so you saw failure everywhere you looked. I could have stopped there. It would have been enough. But I'd been quiet for 7 years, and the words kept coming. Every time you made a comment about my little job, or suggested I couldn't afford Oliver's school expenses, or offered me your used furniture because you assumed I needed it, that was your assumption, not my reality. I drive a Honda because I like Honda. I live modestly because I'm building generational wealth for my son, not because I have to. Every choice I made was strategic. Every silence was on purpose. Patricia tried to stand up. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. She sat back down hard, the chair making that sound against the marble floor. Her hands were gripping the tablecloth now, knuckles white. Margaret reached over and gently extracted the card from Patricia's grip. She handed it back to Oliver, who'd been standing there watching the adults argue over something he didn't fully understand. Thank you for the beautiful card, sweetheart, Margaret told him. I'm going to put it with my most special things. Oliver beamed. You're welcome, Grandma Margaret. Do you want to come see the fish house sometime? We have a rowboat. I would love that. Patricia made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. This is insane. Margaret, you can't seriously be okay with this. I'm perfectly okay with it. Edward made the right choice. Oliver loves that property the way none of your children ever did, Patricia. He spends his summers there. He knows every tree and rock and the best spots for catching bass. That's what Edward wanted, someone who would care for the place, not just own it. I care about it. You care about what it's worth. There's a difference. Richard cleared his throat from his seat next to Patricia. He'd been watching the whole thing with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pat, maybe we should discuss this later. This isn't the time. When is the time, Richard? When were any of you planning to tell me that family property had been given away to a 7-year-old? Edward's property, Margaret corrected. Not family property. Edward's. And he gave it to his great-grandson, who is family. Who will probably sell it the minute he turns 18. No, I won't. Oliver's voice was small but firm. Grandpa Edward told me to take care of it. So I'm going to. The simplicity of it seemed to hit Patricia harder than any of my financial disclosures. She stared at Oliver, and something in her face crumbled. Marcus had moved closer during the confrontation. He was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Why didn't you tell me? About the consulting practice, the building, any of it. Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was lying to get more child support? He flinched. That's not fair. Neither is assuming your ex-wife is barely scraping by without bothering to ask how she's actually doing. Stephanie put her hand on Marcus's arm. She'd been silent through the whole thing, but now she spoke up. Marcus, she's right. We never asked. Because I thought, he stopped. Started again. The apartment, the car, the way you dress. It all looked like you were just getting by. I was getting by. I'm also building wealth. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. If you have been watching this unfold and you are not subscribed yet, I am telling you, you are going to want to be here for the next one. The stories on this channel only get more intense from here, and you will not want to miss them. Helen had made her way around the table. She pulled me into a hug, which I hadn't been expecting. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For assuming. For not asking. I should have known you better than that. The apology caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for more confrontation, more accusations. Not this. It's okay, I managed. It's not. But thank you for saying so. Patricia was still sitting there, her champagne-colored dress looking suddenly less elegant under the ballroom lights. Her hair was still perfect, her makeup still flawless, but something fundamental had shifted in how she carried herself. She looked smaller, diminished. Donald helped her to her feet. Come on, Pat. Let's get some air. She didn't resist. She let him guide her toward the terrace doors, moving carefully like someone who wasn't sure the floor would hold. The room stayed quiet for another moment. Then someone at a far table started talking again, deliberately loud, about the weather. Someone else asked about dessert. The spell broke, and people went back to their conversations, though I could feel them watching me from the corners of their eyes. Margaret beckoned me closer. I came around to her side of the table, and she took my hand. Edward would be proud of you, she said. Not because of the money. Because you built something stable for Oliver while letting him keep his childhood. That's harder than it sounds. I felt something loosen in my chest, some tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Thank you. And for what it's worth, I think you were right to keep it quiet. Patricia would have made your life miserable if she'd known sooner. At least this way, Oliver got to enjoy the lake house in peace. Oliver had climbed into the chair next to Margaret and was showing her his crayon drawing in detail, pointing out where the dock was and where we tied up the rowboat and where the best trees for climbing were located. She listened with complete attention, asking questions about the fish he'd caught and whether we'd seen any loons this year. I watched them together and felt that same ache I'd felt watching Oliver fish with Edward. This was what family was supposed to look like. This was what it meant to be valued for who you were, not what you could provide. The party wound down shortly after that. People started making their exits, thanking Margaret, collecting their coats. A few people stopped by to congratulate me on my success, though the congratulations felt tinged with something else, surprise, maybe, or the recalibration of their mental categories. Marcus and Stephanie left without saying goodbye. I saw them heading toward the parking lot, Stephanie walking close to Marcus with her hand on his back. They'd have things to discuss on the drive home. Patricia didn't come back inside. Through the terrace windows, I could see her sitting on a bench with Donald standing nearby. She wasn't crying, at least not visibly. She was just staring out at the golf course, motionless. Helen helped me gather our things. Oliver had taken off his dress shoes the moment dinner ended, and finding them again required a search party of 3 adults and 1 child. We eventually located them under a table near the bar. Will you bring Oliver by next week? Helen asked as we walked toward the exit. I'd like to spend some time with him. Without all this, she gestured vaguely at the ballroom. Family politics. I'd like that. Oliver would too. And Rebecca? If you need anything, help with the property maintenance, advice on anything, I mean it. Ask. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without my voice breaking. Oliver fell asleep in the car on the drive home, still wearing his suit jacket and holding his dinosaur-shaped chicken fingers in a to-go container the kitchen staff had packed for him. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his head tilted against the window, his mouth slightly open. He had no idea what he'd set in motion tonight. To him, it had been a simple thing, giving his great-grandmother a thank-you card. The way his mother had taught him was polite. He couldn't have known it would detonate 7 years of secrets, or that his crayon drawing of the lake house would be the catalyst that finally forced the truth into the open. Maybe that was better. Maybe children should get to do simple things for simple reasons, without calculating the consequences the way adults had to. I carried him upstairs when we got home, managed to get him into his pajamas without fully waking him, and tucked him into bed. He mumbled something about fish and rolled over, hugging his pillow. My phone buzzed as I was getting ready for bed. A text from Louise Carmichael, my attorney. She must have heard about the party through some family connection. I assumed tonight went well, or I'd be getting legal threats by now. Congratulations on maintaining the secret for 7 years. That's impressive restraint. I texted back, the secret's out now. We'll see what happens next. Her response came through immediately. Patricia can hire anyone she wants. The deed transfer is bulletproof. Sleep well. I did sleep well, for the first time in years. The weight of the secret had been heavier than I'd realized, a constant background pressure that I'd gotten so used to carrying I'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The fallout came in stages over the following weeks. Patricia did hire an attorney, a man named Gerald Pemberton who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for being aggressive. He sent Louise a letter demanding copies of all documents related to the property transfer, questioning Edward's mental state at the time of signing, and suggesting that I had unduly influenced an elderly man for personal gain. Louise responded with a package containing Edward's complete medical records from the 6 months preceding the transfer, showing no cognitive decline whatsoever. She included the deposition from the notary who'd witnessed the signing, confirming that Edward had been lucid, articulate, and very clear about his intentions. She added the letter Edward had written to his children explaining his decision, which he'd given to Louise to be delivered in the event anyone contested the transfer. The letter was vintage Edward, formal, detailed, and unambiguous. He laid out his reasoning. Oliver was the only great-grandchild who'd shown genuine interest in the property. Oliver had spent meaningful time there with Edward, learning to fish and identify trees and appreciate the land. Oliver's mother had never once suggested selling or developing the property, in contrast to multiple family members who'd made such suggestions repeatedly. Edward wanted the lake house to be loved, not liquidated. Gerald Pemberton read the letter, reviewed the documentation, and advised Patricia that pursuing litigation would be expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. The property transfer was legal. Edward's mental capacity was thoroughly documented. There was no evidence of undue influence. Patricia dropped the legal challenge 2 weeks after she'd started it. But the social consequences were just beginning. Richard's wife Susan, who'd stayed quiet during the birthday party confrontation, called Patricia 3 days after the event. According to Helen, who heard it from her own daughter, who'd heard it from Susan's sister, the conversation had been brief and cold. Susan told Patricia that her behavior at Margaret's party had been embarrassing and cruel. She said that trying to humiliate a 7-year-old child for giving his great-grandmother a handmade card was beneath contempt. She said that Edward had been right to keep his decision private, given how Patricia had reacted when she'd finally found out. Then Susan hung up and didn't answer when Patricia called back. The library where Margaret had volunteered started planning their annual fundraiser gala. Patricia had been on the planning committee for 12 years, ever since she'd retired from her own career in pharmaceutical sales. She'd always taken a leadership role, selecting the venue, coordinating with caterers, managing the silent auction. The committee chair called her in early April. They'd decided to go in a different direction this year. They appreciated her past contributions, but they thought it was time to bring in some new voices. They'd keep her on the mailing list for the event, of course. She was welcome to attend as a guest. Patricia understood what that meant. She'd been removed. Quietly, diplomatically, but definitely removed. Helen told me about it when she came by to take Oliver to the Science Museum. She's devastated, Helen said. That committee was her entire social calendar. I didn't ask them to remove her, I said. I know. But people talk. What happened at the party got around. People are reassessing how they see Patricia. Realizing maybe she's not as gracious as they thought. Donald, Patricia's husband, filed for separation in May. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences and requested an equitable division of marital assets. He moved into a corporate apartment near his office and started seeing a therapist. Helen said he'd told Richard that he was tired of living in Patricia's performance of what a successful marriage should look like. He was tired of the charity galas and the country club politics and the constant measuring of himself against other people's achievements. He wanted something quieter. Something real. The divorce finalized 8 months later. Patricia kept the house, but had to refinance to buy out Donald's share of the equity. The settlement cost her $340,000, which she paid from her retirement accounts, triggering significant tax penalties. She moved from the 5-bedroom colonial in Newton to a 2-bedroom condo in Needham. Still a nice place, still a good neighborhood, but the downgrade was visible to everyone who knew her. Her daughter stopped returning her calls with any regularity. Her son started making excuses about why he couldn't make it to Sunday dinners. The social circle that had orbited around her for years quietly redistributed itself, finding new centers of gravity. I ran into her once, about a year after Margaret's birthday party. I was at Whole Foods with Oliver, letting him pick out fruit for his school lunches. She was in the produce section, examining avocados with the kind of intense focus people use when they're trying to avoid making eye contact with someone they don't want to talk to. But Oliver saw her first. "Hi, Aunt Patricia," he said, because I'd raised him to be polite to family even when family hadn't been polite to us. She looked up, startled. For a moment I saw her struggle with the decision, ignore us, acknowledge us, try to restart a relationship that had imploded spectacularly in front of 60 witnesses. "Hello, Oliver," she said finally. Her voice was different than I remembered. Quieter. Less certain. "How are you?" "Good. We got to dissect a frog in science class. It was awesome." "That sounds educational." An awkward pause. I could have walked away. Probably should have. But something made me stay, made me give her the opening to say whatever it was she'd been rehearsing in her head for the past year. "Rebecca." She looked at me directly for the first time. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I made assumptions about you. About your life, your capabilities, your worth to this family. I was wrong. I was cruel. And I'm sorry." The apology was stiff, formal, the kind of thing that cost her to say. I could see the effort in the way she held her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. "Thank you," I said. Because that's what you say when someone apologizes, even when the apology comes a year too late and can undo the years of small cruelties that preceded it. Edward was right, Patricia continued. "About the lake house. About Oliver. She stopped. About a lot of things." Oliver was tugging on my sleeve, ready to move on to the next section of the store. I put my hand on his shoulder. "I hope things get better for you, Patricia," I said. And I meant it, surprisingly. I didn't want her back in my life. I didn't want to rebuild a relationship that had never been healthy to begin with. But I didn't want her to suffer forever either. I just wanted her to be far away and not my problem anymore. She nodded, understanding the dismissal for what it was. "Take care of that property," she said to Oliver. "It's special." "I will," Oliver promised. Then he dragged me toward the bakery section, already forgetting the encounter in favor of lobbying for the cookies he knew I'd let him get if he ate all his vegetables that week. I looked back once. Patricia was still standing there in the produce section, holding an avocado she probably didn't need, looking smaller and older than she had at Margaret's party. I turned away and followed my son. That was 14 months ago. Oliver's 8 now, getting ready to finish 3rd grade. We spent 3 weeks at the lake house this past summer. Dale replaced the dock boards again and fixed a leak in the boathouse roof. Oliver caught a bass that actually was as big as he'd claimed at Margaret's party, and we took a picture of him holding it before we released it back into the water. He started inviting friends from school to come visit. They swim off the dock and roast marshmallows in the fire pit and run through the pine trees like small wild things. They don't know the house is worth $400,000 or that it's part of a complicated family history. They just know it's the coolest place. Oliver's mom takes him in the summer. My consulting practice did $900,000 in revenue last year. I hired an associate to help manage the workload, a recent graduate from Bentley who's smart and eager and reminds me of myself 10 years ago. I'm teaching her the same thing I had to learn the hard way, that success doesn't have to be loud to be real. The apartment building appreciated another $60,000. I refinanced at a lower rate and used the cash out to fund a Roth IRA for Oliver. By the time he's my age, he'll have generational wealth that isn't just property, it's options. Marcus and I have a functional co-parenting relationship now. Not warm, but workable. He pays child support on time. He takes Oliver every other weekend and actually engages with him instead of parking him in front of the television. Stephanie's been good for him in that way. She doesn't let him check out emotionally. They came to the lake house once last summer. Marcus wanted to see the property, understand what Edward had seen in it. I gave him the tour, the house, the dock, the 2 acres of woods sloping down to the water. He didn't say much, just walked around with his hands in his pockets, looking at everything like he was seeing it for the first time. I get it now, he said finally. Why Dad signed it over to Oliver. This place needs someone who'll love it. I would have just seen the maintenance costs. I know, I said. I'm sorry. For assuming you were struggling. For not asking how you actually were. I know that too. We stood on the dock, watching Oliver and Stephanie try to catch frogs at the water's edge. The sun was setting, turning the lake gold and pink. He's lucky, Marcus said. To have you. To have this. I didn't argue with him. Oliver was lucky. But luck was only part of it. The rest was 7 years of strategic decisions, careful planning, and keeping my mouth shut when people underestimated me. Margaret died last October, peacefully in her sleep at age 81. The funeral was small, family only. Patricia was there, sitting in the back row with Donald, who'd come to pay his respects despite the divorce. They didn't sit together, but they were civil to each other. Margaret had left specific instructions in her will. Her financial accounts were divided equally among her children and grandchildren. Her jewelry went to various female relatives. Her books went to the library. And she left a letter for Oliver, to be given to him when he turned 18. Louise has it in her office safe. I don't know what it says. But knowing Margaret, it's probably full of practical wisdom and the kind of clear-eyed assessment of human nature that made people either love her or avoid her entirely. Oliver still asks about Grandpa Edward sometimes. We have pictures of them together, fishing off the dock or working in the garden or just sitting on the porch in comfortable silence. Oliver remembers enough to know he lost something important when Edward died. But he has the lake house, and that's Edward's real legacy, not the property itself, but what it represents. The belief that a child could be trusted with something valuable. The faith that love matters more than money. I'm teaching Oliver how to manage money now in age-appropriate ways. He knows we own the apartment building. He knows about my consulting practice. He understands that the lake house is his and that ownership comes with responsibilities, property taxes, maintenance, respect for the land. He doesn't know yet that he's going to inherit $250,000 in retirement accounts when he turns 25, or that his college is fully funded, or that the choices I made in my 30s are going to give him options in his 20s that I never had. He'll learn all of that eventually. For now, he's 8. He catches frogs and climbs trees and argues with me about bedtime. He makes thank you cards for people he loves, not because he's calculated the social benefits, but because someone taught him it's the right thing to do. That's enough. So, did I go too far keeping the lake house secret for 7 years? Or not far enough in protecting my son from people who would have used it against us? Tell me in the comments.